Good evening, friends, and welcome back to Mr. NightSpook. I'll be your storyteller tonight, here to keep you company in the dark hours. Tonight we're heading to a place heavy with silence, Sleepy Hollow Graves, where more than one stranger swears they felt footsteps trailing just behind them. I'll share those unsettling whispers with you, but before we step inside, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it right now in your state or your country? Drop it in the comments below so I know who's walking with me in the night. Settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. I backed into the job by accident, the way you back into a dark room, one hand out feeling for the light switch you're not sure is there. I'd been living in Tarrytown for 6 months after a breakup and a lease that doubled because the landlord found religion in luxury conversions. I was piecing together nights at the diner and mornings shelving paperbacks at the used bookstore when I saw a flyer taped to a lamppost. Sleepy Hollow Ghost Tours, hiring seasonal guides. Must like people in walking. The part about liking people was ambitious for me, but I can walk all night if the company is history. My name is Nora Keene, and I talk too fast when I'm nervous. The first night I showed up at the office, a little storefront next to a wine bar, windows painted with a playful skull and a tricorn hat. I tried to slow it down. The manager, a sandy-haired guy named Vic who had the pleasant, practiced voice of someone who says the same 3 jokes to 4 tours a night, ran me through the script. He gave me a black cloak that smelled faintly of dryer sheets and the deep costume trunk where we keep wool scarves for tourists who underestimated October by the Hudson. He walked me through the route, the chain of lamps that makes a dotted line through the cemetery and the older village lanes, the places the ground dips and your voice carries. He taught me where to pause long enough for people to shiver, where to time the punchline so the wind will do half your work. The whole thing is theater until it isn't, he said, with a chuckle that didn't quite meet his eyes. The tours were small that first week. Leaf peepers, a couple first dates, a family from Yonkers with a teen who recorded everything. I fell into the rhythm quick. You start at the Phillipsburg Church with its glitter of candlelight and the smell of cold limestone. Cross the old Dutch bridge where the water whispers itself to sleep, and up the graded path that threads the cemetery. I learned when to lower my voice and where the gravel is loudest and how people lean toward you when they're afraid, even if they came to be scared on purpose. I tended to walk a little fast, and Vic told me to watch it. People don't want a cardio class on their ghost story, he said. Let the dread walk. Don't make it run. It was on my 3rd night that I noticed a man at the back. The first groups blur together a little. Faces fade into the steam of their breath. But at the end of that tour, as I collected the lantern and the tip jar, I counted heads by habit and came up one too many. A tall figure lingered beyond the last patch of lamplight, not with the friendly, tentative bob of someone about to ask a question, but the straight, unbending stillness of a street sign. He wore a long coat, no hat. I remember thinking his silhouette looked slightly wrong, as if the shoulders were a little too square or the coat hung too flat for the wind that slithered down the hill. I waved. "We're wrapped here," I called, the guide voice slipping back into my regular one. The man didn't answer. He made the smallest shift of weight, like a decision settling into bone. Then the teenage filmer cut in front of him on the path, and the man wasn't there when the kid passed. Just the sigh of leaves and the smell of wet iron, which is what I think of when I think of old graves. Back at the office, I joked about the extra guest, and Vic held out the roster without smiling. 32 on paper, he said, and we counted 32 tickets. That happens, he said. People drift. People cut through. The cemetery is a public place. His voice made a neat little box around the idea and put it on a high shelf. Night 5. Different group. A pair of retired teachers who kept nodding at each other as if I were confirming long-held suspicions about history. 2 college kids with matching nose rings. A woman who asked if the Headless Horseman was covered under her travel insurance. I was telling the story of the unnamed riverboat traveler who lost his ring in the mud and kept finding it in his pocket decades later, and then woke with his hand black to the wrist when the hairs on my arms went up one by one, like a wheat field lifting to the wind. It's one of those sensations you want to laugh off and can't, like a drop of water rolling into your ear. I turned my head just enough to look back down the path. He was there, back of the group, last position, where the lantern light runs thin and the dark is more suggestion than fact. Same long coat, same squareness to the shoulders, same stillness. It might have been a trick of light, but his outline didn't flicker with the shifting shadows of people around him. It was like someone had pressed a paper cutout into the night. I slowed the tour even more after that. I lingered at the stories until they pressed their own weight onto the path. I lost him on one turn and found him on the next, and people began to throw me the kind of looks that mean you're wearing your nerves on your face. At the end, by the gate where the lamps are honest, I counted again. 27 tickets. 27 people. 28 shadows. If you've ever tried to describe something that refuses to hold still long enough to be described, you know the helpless embarrassment that goes with it. I told Vic. He looked at me like you look at someone who says they have a migraine, sympathetic, remote, a little bored. "You're good up there," he said, pouring coffee into a paper cup with the skull logo. "You pull them in. But this isn't improv. Stick to the script. You'll spook yourself." I started asking the other guides in the casual, nonchalant way people interrogate each other when they don't want to admit they need the answer. "You ever get extras?" I said to Lena, who wore fingerless gloves and had the dry, sharp humor of someone who's been under stage lights. She laughed. "If I did, I'd charge him," she said. Then after a beat, "You mean with you? I walked behind your group last night for a stretch. He was behind you, not me." She said it like a joke, but as we parted, she looked over her shoulder. Just once. That night the fog came down early and the lamps cast fat, soft halos that ended abruptly, like someone drew a chalk line around each light, and the darkness obeyed it. My group was 15 strong, the sweet spot. I felt them breathe as a collective animal when I paused. I felt them lean forward when I whispered. And every time we moved, he moved. There are only so many times you can look back without making your people think something is really wrong. And tourists like thinking something's wrong only as long as they don't have to believe it. I started trying to catch him head on. At the turns, I would step aside and let everyone file past one by one, the way you check your pockets before you leave a hotel room. A tall man in a long coat would approach the corner of my eye and then belong to somebody else. At the very last, with the gates yawning their iron mouths, I made a decision I didn't know I was going to make until I made it. I stepped into the path, lifted my lantern, and said, "Sir, are you with us?" The couple closest to me blinked like owls. The man said, "Huh?" And the woman's lip curled in a tiny private smile. Behind them, where the coat should have been, there was only a smear of fog and the thin sound of somebody's keychain. I couldn't keep it in anymore. In the office, with the heater clicking like its own haunted chorus, I told Vic it wasn't funny and it wasn't part of any show. He sighed and took me upstairs to the little room where they keep the monitors that face the office, the churchyard, the street. He pulled up our time block, fast-forwarded, then slowed. There I am, tiny and theatrical like a bobblehead with a lantern. There are my people. The boy lifting his phone. The woman fiddling with the scarf. The tall man in the long coat is not there. Vic sipped his coffee. "Camera misses things," he said, but his voice had softened like he already knew his line was flimsy. "When you bring a dread home, you don't mean to. You think you can leave it at the gate the way you leave a borrowed coat on a chair. But the thing about a job is it becomes your life by small increments, a little of your voice at a time." I kept catching that extra shape where there wasn't room for it. Reflections in shop windows would bulge with an outline that didn't belong to anybody in front of me. A bus would pass, and in the mirror behind the driver, a coat would tilt its head like it was looking for the right seat. In my apartment, which was one narrow room and a galley kitchen and the kind of bathroom that's too honest about winter, I'd unlock the door and feel the air wobble. Like a body had moved just out of my path. Lena said, "Okay, I've seen him now." We were splitting a bag of pretzels in the alley and she said it flat, no sarcasm. "When I'm sweeping behind your group, he's there. If I'm leading, he isn't. Like he's trailing you, not the tour." When she handed me the pretzels, our fingers touched and hers were cold and damp even with her gloves. "This place eats certain kinds of people," she said. "Every town does. It finds your shape." 2-week anniversary of my first night, a Wednesday, the streets emptied out early. The village felt like a stage after the show ended. Props left where they fell, the smell of fog machine in the curtains. I drove the borrowed Corolla home with the heater not quite keeping up. Radio low because talk makes me feel less alone. I glanced in the rear view because you always do in that bend where the streetlights thin and the park opens its dark mouth. He was there. No flicker, no double take. Sitting directly behind me as if the back seat were the most obvious place in the world to sit. Face hard to pin to features like someone had smudged it with a thumb. Coat smooth. hands resting on his knees. If you've ever been truly frightened while driving, you know how the car suddenly becomes a ship and every instrument a way to keep it from capsizing. I didn't slam the brakes. I didn't look back. I looked at the mirror the way you look at a dog that's decided to love you too much. I told myself the seat was empty and the mirror had eaten its own reflection. I told myself the brain is a dumb projector that plays the film it's been given. At the stop sign, the radio went to static. Not because radios do that in scary moments, but because mine sometimes does when it's cold. "You can get out," I said. My voice the guide voice and my voice not. "This is not your stop." When I finally pulled into my block and found a space and killed the lights, I forced myself to turn around, because I knew I'd dream the turn forever if I didn't do it now. The back seat was empty. The fabric was smoothed by no weight. The air lay there like a sleeping thing that could wake if I fed it the wrong word. And yet when my hand touched the seat, the cloth gave back heat, not just warmth from the heater either. The shape of it was wrong. It was a heat with edges. After that, he stopped pretending to belong to the tours and started to treat the rest of my life like the route. Clothes I didn't remember wearing would have a smell I associated with damp leaves. When I passed the mirror in the morning, my posture looked borrowed from someone taller. Guests on my tours started calling me by a name that wasn't mine. "Thank you, Marie," a nice woman said, pressing money into my palm. I opened my mouth to correct her and shut it. The name pinged off some deep chamber inside me like a bat looking for exit. The security footage, when I dared check again, showed the same handful of moments with small rearrangements. My gestures a hair off, a pause that felt like I was waiting for a cue. I called my mother in Massachusetts and told her only the part where I thought I needed to go easy on the night work. She said I always liked cemeteries when I was a kid, which was not the comfort she thought it was. "You'd walk ahead," she said. "Look back to make sure we were following, just like a little tour guide." I almost told her about the man and how he seemed to find me not by sight but by shape, how he adjusted himself to the space where I stood until I was the one doing the adjusting. Instead, I said I missed home, and she said to drink something hot and to please keep my car doors locked, as if that could keep out what rides in the mirror. The final night I led a tour, there was a teenager who kept leaning out of position to take pictures that would blur the lanterns into comets. When we reached the spot where the path narrows between a rank of old stones and a low earth-sunken wall, he said, "Can I ask a question?" I nodded. He said, "Who's the guy in the coat?" "The one who keeps standing behind you." I didn't turn because I couldn't. The group exhaled as a single organism. Then several of them laughed in the hopeful way of people who think they've caught the trick. "Part of the show," someone murmured. "Right?" I said, "We have many actors," and heard the lie wear my voice like my coat wears my shoulders. I moved, and they moved. And I felt him move with us, the way a shadow moves when the light source changes. Later at the gate, the teen showed me his phone. There I was, lantern lifted, mouth mid-sentence. There were the folks huddled into the shape a story teaches them to hold. Behind me was a dark space the size of a man. It wasn't quite a silhouette. It was the absence the silhouette leaves behind when the person who made it has already stepped closer. I didn't quit exactly. I just stopped going. Lena texted a skull, then another, then a question mark. Vic left me a voicemail with a softness I hadn't heard before, as if he were speaking to someone who could break if he pushed too hard. I woke into mornings that felt like the backstage of a dream. Sometimes I caught a smell I couldn't name until I did. Warm fabric. Sometimes I would find 2 coffee rings on my counter and have to think too long to remember which one was mine. On the last day of October, I drove to the cemetery alone. No lantern, no cloak. I wore my regular coat and shoved my hands deep into the pockets and walked the route backward, starting at the gate and ending by the church. The lamps hummed like faraway bees. The fog stroked my hair. I stopped at the narrow place between headstones and wall and stood where I make them stand and listened. At first I heard only my own breathing and the tiny ticks a cooling car makes to let the night know it's done working. Then I heard footsteps behind me that matched mine exactly, because sometimes an echo is just a place gently repeating you until you learn to repeat it back. I don't know whether he was a person once. I don't know whether he chooses us or recognizes some soft spot that will give. I know only the lore we tell the tourists because it keeps the worst parts friendly. A spirit uses the living as anchors to the modern world. He follows until following and leading are the same motion. He stands behind you until you lean back enough to feel his coat around your shoulders, to feel how well it fits. When I turn on the radio now, It finds the station the way your hand finds a familiar doorknob in the dark. The mirror shows me in my car, hands at 10 and 2. Night road unraveling in front of me like ribbon from a spool. Sometimes I see the backseat. Sometimes I don't. Once I reached behind me at a red light and laid my palm in the center of the cushion and found it warm in a way that felt like company. I keep telling myself it's the heater and the closed-in air and nothing more. I keep telling myself names until none of them sound like mine. And on some roads where the lamps thin out and the world gets honest, I talk out loud the way I do when the tour goes quiet. I tell a story about a woman who took a job and found that the story took her back, and I hear a voice behind my voice, steady and patient, as if I'm doing fine and he's only there to make sure I don't lose the way. Burnout doesn't feel like fire. It feels like damp. Like a cold that gets into your bones and never leaves. Like waking up after 12 hours and realizing your body has been asleep but your mind hasn't. I spent the spring telling other people it was okay to grieve and the summer realizing I could no longer. Hear myself think over the white noise of other people's sorrow. I kept a neat office with a diffuser that smelled like orange peel and stress textbooks propped at an encouraging angle. And I started to forget my clients' faces the minute they left the room. That was the worst of it. Faces blurring, stories blending. A woman who lost her mother to a quiet stroke became a girl who buried a dog under a sycamore. Became a man who kept his dead wife's shoes in the hallway so he could trip on them on purpose and pretend she was still there to scold him. They were all dear to me and they all leaked away the minute my door shut. This is not how I was taught to practice. A colleague said the word compassion fatigue and I nodded like I agreed and went home and stared at the ceiling until sunrise. My name is Hannah Hart, and I booked the retreat after a Wednesday that smelled like old coffee and bad rain. The ad said boutique hotel by the river, a short train ride to Sleepy Hollow, the kind of place where you can watch the water comb itself smooth. I imagined quiet. I imagined a town with a main street and a bakery that sold bread with a Mayflower crust. I did not imagine standing in a cemetery with my mouth tasting like copper and saying I'm sorry to a name I didn't remember until later. The train rattled past low warehouse, roofs and flats of weeds that moved like lake water. When it slid into Tarrytown, the afternoon was the color of pewter. The hotel was 3 stories of brick and soft lamps. The desk clerk, a young man with a tie he kept adjusting like it had betrayed him. "Weekend on your own?" he asked, tapping the screen. "Sometimes a nap is the best therapy." He smiled, and I almost told him I charge $150 an hour to suggest exactly that. "I'm just going to walk and breathe and pay no attention to anyone," I said. He handed me a key card and a little sleeve stamped with a willow tree and the words, "We're glad you're here." The hallway smelled like lemon cleaner and somebody's perfume, faint and sad, like a conversation finished 10 minutes ago. I took a riverside walk to thaw the city out of me. The water had the cold iron look that says it knows more history than you do. Couples passed with the careful happiness of people on a first weekend together. A boy on a scooter laughed like a hiccup. The cemetery rose past the park like a patchwork of dark stones and white ones. The hill like the back of something sleeping. Every town has one like it. Sleepy Hollows is famous, of course, which mostly means the paths are wider, and the map at the gate cost $5. It was quieter inside than the park had promised. I don't mean the absence of sound. Cars hushed on the road below. The river breathed. Crows complained and then remembered their mouths were made for other things. But between those things there was a blankness, a room with the air taken out. The guard in the little booth nodded without interest. I climbed a path with my hands in my pockets and read names the way you look at faces on a train. Some families kept together. Their stones like a dinner table, parents and children and spare cousins. Some plotted alone. Somebody had left a spent tea light on a flat granite marker that said, "Beloved Sister." It stuck to the stone when I nudged it. The wax hardened into a kind of scar. Halfway up, the path bent around a stand of trees. The air smelled like wet bark and old marble. There was a little hillock, hardly more than a wrinkle in the lawn, with 3 stones like a row of teeth. I don't know why I went to the middle one. I don't know why my chest got tight. The lettering was shallow, worn by weather and the fingers of people who rubbed names like rosaries. Lydia Hart. The brass dates were polite and vague. 1883, 1906. Below, in a smaller hand, a sentence that surprised me because I'd never seen it on a stone before. She kept her appointment. I stood with my palms pressed to my thighs and my mouth filling with the taste of pennies. The idea to speak was not an idea. It rose like swallowing wrong. The apology came out in a whisper that didn't belong to me. I said, "I'm sorry," and the word rang too loud in the flattened air. A woman with a stroller rolled by on the path below, and her baby turned its head toward me, eyes open and remote. A thread of wind moved through my hair like a hand. I took a step back and found my breath and laughed because it felt like a cliché. A city person crying in a graveyard because the stone had her last name on it. Hard is not uncommon. I could have watched the river instead. I could have taken a nap. On my way down, I passed a tour group halted before a monument shaped like a draped urn. The guide had a practiced voice, the kind you can sit inside like a porch. "It's all in the looking," she was saying. "Stand here and you'll see one story. Stand there and you'll see another." I wanted to ask her about Lydia, but I didn't want to say my name in front of strangers. I kept walking until the iron gate spat me out into the calmer noise of town. Back at the hotel, the room had a window the size of an old TV and a bed that promised to swallow me whole. I turned on the faucet in the bathroom to fill the tub and looked up, and there was a man behind me in the mirror. He wasn't close. He stood just inside the door, a tall shape in a coat that might have been black or might have been any dark thing in bad light. The face was a blur of pale, like the mirror couldn't focus him. I didn't turn around because I wasn't afraid yet. I'd slept so little lately that shadows had started inventing themselves. I said, "Sir, this is the wrong room," in my professional voice, calm and capable, and I opened the door as if I were letting someone pass. The hallway beyond was empty. When I looked back, the mirror held only the bathroom and the tub that was beginning to steam. The surface of the water, trembling to a little applause for some event I had missed. At dinner, I sat at the bar between a couple who were arguing about whether the river was safe to swim in, and a man with the kind of beard that suggests he could tell a good lie about a fish. The bartender said their apple pie would change my religion, and I said my belief system was flexible. My phone lay face down on the wood, and when I lifted it to check the time, the black glass found my face and another shadow behind it. He stood closer than in the bathroom, where a person would stand to speak into your ear. I swiveled on the stool. The aisle behind me was clear. The couple was holding hands now, their argument resolved by someone saying, "I'm sorry," at the right moment. My hands were shaking so hard the spoon in my coffee rang. "Everything okay?" the bartender asked. I said, "I'm, long week. I'm a therapist." People tend to forgive therapists for almost anything when you say that. They think you're made of glass or they think you're made of oak. The bartender made a sympathetic noise and told me a story about his cousin who tried to open a meditation studio and then set the incense display on fire by accident. I laughed because I remembered too. The pie was extraordinary. The crust flaked like paper. While I ate, a notification blinked at the top of my screen. A little calendar ding I didn't recognize. Appointment confirmed. There was no time attached. No place. I slept poorly and woke with a panic dream lodged under my ribs. The room was as cool and tasteful as last night. The bed a soft crater that wanted to keep me. I showered to the sound of the pipes clearing their throats. When the mirror cleared, he was there again, closer than any person should be in a bathroom. The face was a smear, but the suggestion of features resolved into cheekbones and a mouth that was either sorry or about to say so. I snapped my eyes to my own face and practiced that trick of pretending nothing remarkable had happened. I dressed and walked to town with my heart doing the kind of stutter that makes you remember you are a very complicated machine made of meat. Sleepy Hollow was Saturday kind. A woman at the bookstore wore a sweater that looked like she'd cut it from a blanket. She said the best ghost stories are the ones that start with something too ordinary to notice. I said I'd take the book with the horseman on the cover anyway. In the reflection of the shop window, he was behind my shoulder, close enough that the collar of his coat tickled my neck. I broke like a string. The bell over the door jangled too loudly when I moved. Outside, the air was damp and bright, the clouds looking for somewhere else to be. I took my phone out. It vibrated in my hand and went dark as if exhausted. And in the screen I saw him again. So near the outline of his mouth seemed like an imprint on my skin. I walked all the way to the cemetery before I knew that's where my feet wanted to go. The guard glanced at me and then looked away, uninterested in the fact that the world had tilted. I found the 3 stones by the stand of trees like I had lived on that path for years. Lydia Hart waited with her patience carved into stone. I laid my fingers on the letters. Cold sang up through bone. The sky darkened without meaning to, a cloud having second thoughts. I said, "Who are you to me?" and felt the words chew their way out. I took a picture of the stone and sent it to my mother because that is what you do when the past throws a rope. I didn't add any text. She replied 2 minutes later with a heart and then a bubble that said, "Call me when you can." I called from the path with a crow heckling us from somewhere I couldn't see. My mother is one of those women who always sounds like she's just stepped out of a kitchen where something good is baking. "Hannah, honey," she said. "I didn't want to say anything that would sway you, but I was wondering if you'd feel something there." "Feel what?" I said, and my mouth tasted like copper again. "The hearts came from that way. Great something. Your grandfather never wanted to talk about them because his own father was a drinker and a wanderer. Left appointments like broken plates. There was a story about a young woman who went off to the river and didn't come back, and her brother swore he saw her face everywhere after, in the window glass and in the lid of the kettle. It sounds silly out loud. People didn't have enough to do then, so a grief turned into a ghost. We're very good at that as a species." "She kept her appointment," I said. "Oh," my mother said, and then the silence changed, as if she had remembered the end of a story she had been trying not to tell. "I think you should come home," she said. "There are things I ought to dig up and say where we keep the good light." "I'm okay," I said, which was half true and half a lie I could get away with because I am a professional liar of a very specific kind. I tell people that what they feel is understandable. I tell them they can carry it. I tell them we are not bound by the past. On the path, a tour group paused and the guide told the same story about standing here and standing there and seeing the same stone change. Back in town, I stepped into a shop that sold nothing useful. Bells, scarves, postcards that imagined the town in a prettier century. The owner, a woman with hair the color of a crow's wing, looked up at me once and then again as if something had moved behind my face. "You're a heart," she said, which is not a question and not something a person should say to a stranger. I felt the scalp prick of panic and tried a smile. "My name is on my card," I lied. She shook her head. "No, it's in the jaw," she said. "They have a certain look." She set a little mirror on the counter as if she meant to adjust her makeup. In it, his face had resolved one notch more. I saw the impression of eyes that weren't mine, a cut on the lip, a bruise like a thumbprint at the throat. I looked away and walked out with my mouth full of the word no, and the bell shouting behind me like a witness. I ate lunch in my room, if lunch is a handful of almonds and a banana choked down between gulps of hotel water. I lay on the bed and set an alarm for a nap and stared at the ceiling, which was smooth and white and pretending not to be a lid. The calendar app on my phone chimed again. Appointment today, it said, and the time was not a time. It was a place. Riverside. I turned the phone off and watched my own hands make the gesture of someone praying because the body knows older postures than the mind. At dusk, I walked to the river with the rest of the town. Light did that kind thing water does when it catches itself. I stood at the railing. The wind brought me the smell of wet metal and cut grass. I could feel him behind me without looking. It was the human sense we don't talk about because we don't have language for it. The one that knows when a room has another heartbeat in it. "What do you want?" I asked, and the quiet that followed wasn't empty. It had a shape. A man in a tour guide jacket stood on the path and pretended to look at his phone so he could listen without scaring me. He said to the phone or to me, "Sometimes you just have to say it, miss." His face was the sort you trust in the first 5 seconds or never. I kept my eyes on the water and said to the place where my reflection would be if the angle were right, "I am sorry. I think we left you here. I think we didn't come back." I think the word appointment was a thing men said to feel bigger than a river. A breath moved against the back of my neck. For the first time, I felt warmth, as if whoever had been stalking the cold parts of me had found a pocket of heat to use. "Do you want me?" I asked, which sounded theatrical but at the time was only honest. The man in the tour jacket drifted away like a person leaving a room where two people have decided something private. The water darkened as if it had changed its mind about wanting to be seen. That night, I slept with the bathroom light on because the idea of the mirror in total dark made my heart skip in a way that scared me. I dreamed a dream I think was not a dream. I stood at the little hillock with the 3 stones and touched Lydia Hart's name, and my fingertips came away dusty with the years they had been pressing there. A voice that could have been my mother's and could have been mine said softly, "She kept her appointment," and another voice, younger and raw, said, What did you want me to do? The river was cold and loud. I knocked and no one opened. I woke to the sound of running water and for a while didn't know what world I was in until I realized the toilet had decided to refill itself very slowly, a thin, hiss-like breath. In the morning, I told myself I was leaving. I packed as if a fire had been declared. The key card looked small and guilty in my palm. When I stepped into the bathroom to brush my teeth, his face was in the mirror as plain as mine. The eyes were grave and not unkind. The mouth looked like my mouth would look if someone's fingers had gripped it and left a mark. He was not in the room. He was only behind the glass, the way a memory stands 1 inch behind your present. I tilted my head and he tilted his. A trick of vision, the therapist says. The mirror wants to show what you put into it. The part of me that had said I'm sorry in the cemetery leaned toward him. His lips moved. The sound when it came was the quietest thing I have ever heard. It was the sound of someone who has learned how to be heard through wood and water. He said, "Late," very gently, and then the bathroom light flickered like a tired eye. At checkout, the clerk with the traitorous tie said, "We hope you'll come back," and slid the sleeve with the willow tree across to me like a little offering. There was a print at the bottom I hadn't noticed when I arrived. A line of text so faint it might have been a joke. "We keep our appointments." I held it up and he laughed. "Marketing," he said. I think the owner thought it sounded classy, like a doctor's office if a doctor's office had pie. I walked to the station with the sensation of someone pacing me half a step behind. I didn't look in windows. On the platform, I stood where the peeling paint on the bench spelled out a word that had once been something else. The train came in a wind of warm air and oil. I climbed aboard and found a seat by the window, because you never outgrow wanting to watch the scenery move. When I looked in the glass, it showed me my face and the carriage behind me, and a man who sat in the seat across the aisle and 1 row back, his coat like a shadow, his eyes soft with patience. No one sat there in the flesh. My phone, which I had turned on without remembering doing it, pulsed one last notification. "Appointment complete," it said, and the time stamped itself in the present like a finger on a wrist. The city came toward me with its hard plains and reliable lies. I could wait to tell my mother. We could make tea and say names we had ignored for years. That would be something. I thought of the sentence on the stone and the calendar and the river's iron breath and the mouths of men who think their words mean more than water. I stared at the place in the window, where his face hovered just far enough behind mine to make us kin. The train slid into a tunnel and my reflection filled the glass. For a moment we were only me, sleep-deprived and ordinary and determined to return to the work of telling other people they could carry what they had been given. Then the lights went out for a breath between stations, and in the black I felt the weight on the seat beside me, warm and definite as a hand. When the fluorescence flared to life, the seat was empty except for the depressions a body leaves when it has been sitting patiently for a long time. I don't know who made the appointment first. I don't know if I kept hers or she kept mine, or if the word is only a way for us to pretend we choose. Back in my office sometimes I catch him behind me in the dark face of the powered-down monitor, a little row back, as if there are rows now, as if there's always been assigned seating for the people we carry. He isn't unkind. He isn't kind. He looks like someone who has been waiting underwater and has learned what waiting does to a mouth. On certain afternoons when the sun hangs in my window like a coin and the building across the street throws my own life back at me in squares, I say without turning around, "I'm sorry," and my breath fogs the glass even when it isn't cold. Some nights right before sleep I mouth the word late and wonder which of us I'm accusing, and some mornings the calendar pings a little reminder with no time and no place. And I listen to the silence that follows the way you listen to a door you've already closed to see if a hand is moving on the other side. I've always believed that teaching history means making the dead speak. Not literally, of course, at least that's what I thought until October of last year. I'd been teaching American history at Tarrytown High for 7 years, and every autumn I did the same field trip, a walking tour of Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. The kids loved it. Well, most of them tolerated it. Either way, it beat another day of PowerPoint slides about the Battle of Saratoga. My name is David Keller, and I live alone in a converted textile mill on the edge of town. It's the kind of place with exposed brick and radiators that clank all night, drafty and atmospheric. I liked it. The rent was cheap and I could walk to school when the weather cooperated. That Wednesday started like any other field trip day. I handed out permission slips I should have collected weeks ago, loaded 23 juniors onto a yellow bus that smelled like old vinyl and teenage body spray, and headed north toward the cemetery. The leaves were turning, that perfect October palette of rust and gold. Emma Chen sat in the back as always, her nose buried in a paperback. Emma was the kind of student teachers worry about, not because she was troubled, but because she was invisible, quiet, overlooked, the type who could disappear from a yearbook photo and no one would notice the empty space. We arrived just after 10. The cemetery sprawled across rolling hills dotted with ornate Victorian monuments and modest Puritan headstones. I'd done this tour a dozen times. I knew which graves belonged to Washington Irving's contemporaries, where the Revolutionary War soldiers were buried, which crypts supposedly had the best ghost stories. The kids followed in a loose cluster, half listening as I talked about the Battle of White Plains and local folklore. I was mid-sentence, describing how Continental soldiers sometimes died of infection weeks after minor wounds, when Emma raised her hand. This alone was unusual. Emma never volunteered. "Mr. Keller?" Her voice was barely audible over the October wind rustling through the oaks. "Yeah, Emma? Who's that man walking behind you?" I turned around. Nothing but headstones and shadows. "What man?" "The one in the old uniform. He's been following you since we got here." She pointed past my shoulder with a trembling finger. A few kids snickered. I smiled, trying to ease the tension. "Nice try, Emma. Trying to spook me before Halloween?" But she wasn't smiling. Her face had gone pale and she wouldn't look directly at me. She was staring at the space just over my left shoulder. Then Marcus Williams spoke up. Marcus was a linebacker, not the type to play along with ghost stories. "I see him too, Mr. K, dude in like a blue coat."
"Old-timey?"
My smile faltered. "Come on, guys. I see him," another voice said. Then another. 5 students total, scattered throughout the group, all staring at the same spot behind me. The air suddenly felt colder. The sun seemed dimmer, though the sky was cloudless. I turned around again, slower this time, scanning the cemetery with genuine unease. Nothing. Just monuments and fallen leaves and the distant sounds of traffic on Route 9. "All right. Very funny," I said, but my voice sounded thin. "Let's move on. We finished the tour." The mood never quite recovered. Emma wouldn't look at me for the rest of the trip, and when we loaded back onto the bus, I caught her staring out the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. I told myself it was a prank, a coordinated effort to mess with the teacher. Kids did that sometimes, but I didn't really believe it. That evening, I climbed the 3 flights to my apartment with a gnawing unease in my stomach. The stairwell was dim, the landlord was always forgetting to replace bulbs, and my footsteps echoed off the old brick. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and froze. Muddy footprints crossed my living room floor. Not just any mud, the thick cemetery dirt kind, dark and loamy. The prints led from my front door, through the living room, down the short hallway, and into my bedroom. I followed them with my heart hammering. They stopped at my bed, right at the edge, as if someone had stood there looking down at where I slept. I live on the 3rd floor. There's no fire escape outside my windows, no balcony, no rational way for anyone to get in without passing through the front door, which had been locked. I checked every room, every closet, the bathroom with its clawfoot tub and ancient tiles. Nothing. I was alone. But those footprints were real, and when I knelt down to examine them, I caught a smell that made my skin crawl. Damp earth and something else. Something like old wool left to rot in a cellar. I cleaned them up with shaking hands, scrubbing until the hardwood was spotless. I checked the locks 3 times. I didn't sleep that night, just lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the radiator clank and wondering if I was losing my mind. The next morning, I arrived at school exhausted and on edge. Emma was waiting by my classroom door, her backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. "Mr. Keller," she whispered as I unlocked the room. "He's still with you." My keys slipped from my fingers, clattering on the linoleum. "Emma, this isn't funny anymore. I'm not joking." Her eyes were wide, rimmed with dark circles like she hadn't slept either. "He's standing right behind you. The soldier, he's closer than yesterday." I could feel it then, a presence I'd been trying to ignore all morning, a coldness against my back like standing in front of an open freezer. The tiny hairs on my neck stood up. "What does he want?" I heard myself ask. Emma's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "He's touching your shoulder now." I felt it. A pressure, firm and deliberate, like a hand gripping my left shoulder. Not roughly, but with intention. With purpose. I spun around, stumbling backward into my classroom door. Nothing was there, but the pressure remained, a phantom weight I couldn't shake off. "He thinks you're someone else," Emma said, and now there were tears streaming down her face. "He won't leave until he finds him." "The person who—" She stopped, her eyes going wide with terror. "Emma, what? The person who what?" Her voice came out strangled, broken. "The person who killed him." I sent Emma to the guidance counselor and canceled my classes for the day, claiming food poisoning. I drove back to Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. The pressure on my shoulder never lifted. If I turned my head quickly, I could almost see something in my peripheral vision, a shape, a suggestion of blue fabric, a figure that vanished when I tried to look directly at it. The cemetery felt different in daylight solitude, more honest somehow. I wandered through the Revolutionary War section, reading names on weathered stones until I found him. Private Thomas Keller, Continental Army, died November 1776. Age 19, my surname. Same as mine. The stone was simple, nearly illegible with age. I knelt before it, my hands trembling. The pressure on my shoulder intensified, becoming almost painful. I could feel breath on my neck now, cold and earthen, carrying that smell of rot and damp wool. "I'm not him," I said aloud, my voice cracking. "I'm not whoever you think I am." The pressure didn't lessen. If anything, it grew stronger, more insistent. I pulled out my phone and searched frantically. Thomas Keller, Revolutionary War, Sleepy Hollow. The results were sparse, but I found enough. Thomas Keller had been shot by a fellow soldier over a gambling debt, murdered by a man whose name had been lost to history, the killer having deserted before justice could be served. The weight on my shoulder began to burn, like fingers pressing through fabric and skin, reaching for bone. I understood then with horrible clarity. Thomas Keller had been waiting for someone with his name, someone who fit the shape of his betrayer, someone to finally balance the scales. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the gravestone. "I'm sorry for what happened to you, but I'm not him." For a moment, everything went still. The October wind died. Birds stopped singing. The world held its breath. Then I felt something else. Not pressure, but a pulling sensation, like hooks catching in my chest, my shoulders, my spine. The thing behind me wasn't asking anymore. It was taking. When I finally made it back to my car, my left shoulder bore a bruise in the perfect shape of a hand, the fingerprints black as cemetery mud. Emma stopped coming to school after that week. I tried calling her parents, but they'd withdrawn her, no explanation given. I wanted to tell them I understood, that some things are too terrible to rationalize, too real to ignore. I still teach at Tarrytown High. I still live in my third-floor apartment. But I never returned to Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, and I've stopped introducing myself by my full name. At night, I feel the weight on my shoulder, sometimes gentle, sometimes crushing. In mirrors and windows in the corner of my vision, I catch glimpses of blue fabric, a tricorn hat, a face locked in eternal accusation. The substitute never left, and I'm beginning to understand that maybe he never will, not until I pay a debt that isn't mine, for a crime I never committed, to settle a score written in blood and mud 200 years before I was born. Some history, it turns out, refuses to stay buried. Danny Reeves had developed 3 habits in his first week at Sleepy Hollow. Black coffee at 5:30, a 6-mile run through the cemetery by 6, and pretending the conference calls didn't make him want to drive his rental car into the Hudson. The consulting gig was supposed to last a month, maybe 6 weeks if the client dragged their feet on approvals, and he'd rented a cottage on the edge of town that smelled like cedar and old books. It beat the hell out of a Hampton Inn. The cemetery itself was beautiful in that particular Hudson Valley way. Rolling hills, Revolutionary War headstones, mist that clung to the grass like it had nowhere better to be. He discovered the jogging path by accident, following a trail that wound between the old section and the newer plots. By his 3rd morning, he'd memorized every turn. That's when he met Eleanor. She was standing near the Crane family plot, a wire-haired terrier sniffing at her feet. The sun hadn't fully crested the hills yet, and the light came sideways through the trees, all gold and gray. Danny was cooling down, hands on his hips, breathing hard. "Beautiful morning," she said. "Best part of the day," Danny replied, pulling out his earbuds. Eleanor smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She was maybe 70, wearing a wool coat despite it being late September. "Do you know that man is following you?" Danny glanced back down the path. Empty. Just morning mist and tombstones. "Sorry." The tall man. "In the dark clothes. He's been 3 steps behind you since the revolutionary section." She said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd mention someone had dropped their wallet. Danny felt his skin prickle. "I think you're mistaken. I've been alone the whole run." Eleanor's terrier whined and pulled at the leash, suddenly urgent to leave. "Perhaps," she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. "You be careful, young man. Not everyone who walks here is visiting." She left before Danny could respond, the dog practically dragging her down the hill toward the main gates. He stood there another minute, watching the empty path behind him. The mist moved in lazy currents. A crow called from somewhere in the oaks. Nothing else. He shook it off. Old woman, creepy cemetery. His imagination doing what imaginations do, and jogged back to the cottage. The next morning, he didn't think about it until mile 4. The groundskeeper was trimming around a mausoleum, one of those ornate Victorian affairs with weeping angels. Danny had seen him before, usually gave him a wave. Today the man flagged him down. "Hey, listen," the groundskeeper said, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He was maybe 40, face weathered like old leather. "I don't mean to freak you out, but you're being followed." Danny's stomach dropped. "What?" Tall guy dressed like he's going to a funeral in 18 whatever. "Been keeping pace with you the last mile. Thought you should know." The groundskeeper looked genuinely concerned. "You two together?" "There's no one with me," Danny said. His voice came out tight. The groundskeeper frowned, glanced past Danny's shoulder down the trail, then back at Danny. His expression shifted into something uncertain, almost afraid. "Right. Yeah, my mistake." He returned to his trimming without another word. Danny turned. The path stretched empty behind him, disappearing into the mist. He didn't finish the run. He walked back to the cottage, checking behind him every 30 seconds, seeing nothing but cemetery and early light. Inside, he locked the door and stood in the kitchen drinking water straight from the tap, trying to calm his pulse. 2 people. 2 different people, 2 consecutive days telling him the same impossible thing. He called his sister that night. "Maybe they're screwing with you," she said. Small town, bored locals, new face jogging through their cemetery. Classic hazing. Eleanor was 70 years old, Jen. She wasn't hazing me. "Then maybe there is someone following you, like an actual creepy person. Stop running through a graveyard at dawn like you're auditioning for a horror movie." He laughed, but it sounded hollow. "Yeah, maybe." But he didn't stop. He told himself he wasn't going to let local superstition or a couple of odd encounters ruin the only good part of his day. The conference calls were getting worse. The client kept moving goalposts. His boss kept adding deliverables, and the runs kept him sane. Friday morning, a woman on a bicycle stopped him near the main entrance. "Excuse me," she said, slightly breathless. "This is going to sound strange, but is that man with you?" "The one walking behind you?" Danny didn't turn around. "Let me guess. Tall, dark clothes, 3 steps back?" Her eyes widened. "You can see him?" "No," Danny said. "But apparently everyone else can." The woman looked past him and her face went pale. "He's just standing there now, watching us." She clipped back into her pedals. "I don't know what that is, but I'd get out of here if I were you." She rode off fast, not looking back. Danny forced himself to turn around. Nothing. Just tombstones and mist and the distant sound of traffic on Route 9. He stood there for 5 minutes, staring, waiting for something to move. The sun climbed higher. The mist thinned. He walked home, not jogging, watching his shadow stretch long across the grass. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed scrolling through his phone, looking up the history of Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Plenty of famous graves: Andrew Carnegie, Washington Irving, Leona Helmsley. Plenty of ghost stories too, but nothing about a tall figure in dark clothing. Nothing that matched. At 2 a.m, he opened his fitness app to review the week's runs. The app tracked his routes via GPS, laying out each path in bright blue lines across the map. He zoomed in on Wednesday's run, the day Eleanor had first spoken to him. His route showed clearly, winding through the cemetery paths. But there, overlapping his own tracking line, was a second path. Another set of blue dots moving in perfect parallel just behind his own, tracing the same route a few meters back. Danny's mouth went dry. He pulled up Thursday's run. Same thing. 2 paths, 2 sets of GPS dots. The second one following, always following. Friday's run showed it too. But on Friday's map, the second path didn't stop at the cottage like his own did. It continued to the front door and then stopped moving. The timestamp showed it had remained stationary for 3 hours right outside. Danny's hands were shaking. He exited the app, then reopened it. The data didn't change. He got out of bed and walked to the front window, pulling the curtain back an inch. The porch light cast a small yellow circle across the front steps. Beyond it, the yard disappeared into darkness. Route 9 was a distant hum. Nothing moved. He opened the app again. Selected current location. The map loaded. His own dot pulsed inside the cottage, and there, just beyond the front door, was the second dot. Still there, still waiting. Danny stepped back from the window. His breath fogged the glass. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, a wet thrumming sound. The cottage suddenly felt thin-walled, insubstantial. The door seemed like paper. He didn't go near the windows again that night. He sat on the couch with every light on, watching the front door, watching the second dot on his phone screen. It didn't move. By dawn, it was still there. The logical thing would have been to leave, pack the car, check into that Hampton Inn, tell the client something came up. But the sun rose, the world returned to normal proportions, and Danny convinced himself he'd misread the data. GPS glitches, satellite errors, something. He didn't go running. By Monday, he'd almost believed his own explanations. Then the client meeting ran late, and he arrived back at the cottage after dark. As he pulled into the driveway, his headlights swept across the front porch. For just a moment, less than a second, the light caught something standing by the door. Tall, dark, impossibly still, then nothing. Danny sat in the car, engine running, hands locked on the wheel. The porch was empty. He checked his phone, opened the app. 2 dots. One inside the car, one on the porch. He drove to a diner and sat in a booth until midnight, drinking coffee, trying to think. When he finally returned, the cottage was dark. The second dot had moved. It was inside now, in the hallway, waiting between him and the bedroom. Danny didn't go in. He slept in the car that night, parked under a streetlight, doors locked. When dawn came, he checked the app one last time. The second dot was back outside, standing by his car. It had been there all night, just beyond the window. 3 steps away, he never saw it. But it was always there, following, waiting, patient as stone, close as a shadow. And Danny understood finally what it had been waiting for all along, the moment he'd stop running. Before they moved me, I used to wake in the middle of the night and listen for my old life like it was a train that might still pass behind the house if I waited long enough. You don't realize how loud a neighborhood is until you lose it. Sirens in the distance, somebody arguing 2 doors down, the metallic ping of a baseboard heater, the clink of bottles out by the dumpster. In my first temporary apartment, the noise was a comfort because it was proof I was still in a world with other people. After the trial, after the glare of the courtroom and the faces that wouldn't look at me and the ones that looked too long, they let me sleep 3 hours and then packed me in a car before dawn. We didn't use the front entrance. There was a service hallway that smelled like bleach and old coffee, and we walked it like we were carrying a body. My name is Daniel Crane, and I am not the name I was born with. The marshals told me to practice saying it, to say it like it had always belonged to me, to say it when a barista asked and when I signed for a package, and to never hesitate. They said hesitation is the shadow a tale follows. I nodded like a good student. I nodded through the rules, the phones, the bank card, the doctor's office script, the lie I would use if someone asked where I was from. I nodded as if the nodding could smooth the edges off what I'd done. I testified. I sat in a suit that didn't fit and told the truth about men I had once called bosses, who owned restaurants and in the back rooms of those restaurants sold the kind of business that comes with knives and wrapped cash. I thought I was doing the right thing. You can call it fear dressed as conscience if you want. I do, sometimes. The car they moved me in had a Lowe's receipt sliding back and forth on the rubber floor mat. It felt like a joke. The driver, A stocky woman with a patient teacher voice kept the radio at a volume where you could hear the music but not the lyrics. The other marshal sat beside me and asked if I got carsick. I said no and stared out at New York becoming trees and then water. They said the safe house was in Sleepy Hollow, which I knew from grade school and Halloween decorations, a place whose name sounded like a dare. Transitional, they said. Not for long. Just a week while they placed me. The word place formed a ball in my throat. We pulled in near dusk. The safe house stood at the edge of town, a narrow colonial with cheap vinyl siding and eyes like a tired face. There was a strip of woods behind it, and beyond that a tangle of low hills. To the left, a narrow road drifted toward a chain-link fence and a sign that read Public Cemetery, in letters that had lost a little paint. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold stone. Somewhere out there water ran, a creek talking to itself. A train whistle punched the distance, one short exhale. "It's quiet," I said, trying to make a joke of it. "Good quiet," the driver answered. "Install yourself. Keep to the walking routes we flagged. No bars. No chatting up neighbors. Groceries delivered. Stay boring." Inside was furniture that had been bought for the word furniture. A couch that didn't want you to linger. A coffee table light enough to lift with one hand. Pale carpet already stained in a circle where a lamp must have bled coffee. The kitchen had a rolling island and a single plant that had the stiff obedience of plastic. In the bedroom, a new mattress still wore a faint chemical smell. The house had that hollow echo of places that haven't earned their noises yet. No photographs on the walls unless you counted the nail holes like constellations that couldn't decide their shape. I unpacked what I had, which wasn't much. Some basics, a few shirts, a pair of boots I didn't remember buying. They'd already stocked the fridge with the kind of food that spoils quietly. The marshals went over the routes again, pointed to a yellow highlighted path on a paper map with an old-fashioned decisiveness I found comforting. "Keep to these blocks. If you need air, take this loop. If you sense anything off, call. Don't try to be brave. Brave gets people buried." That first night the house popped as the heat clicked on and the pipes gave little throat-clearing coughs. I lay there, eyes open to the nothing, and listened for my old city, but it didn't come. Instead, there was a soft animal step in the woods. The skitter of dry leaves. A late car passing, sound rising and falling like a breath. I counted backwards from 100. At 82, I remembered the face of a man from the restaurant. Headlights across his eyes like bars. At 49, I was a kid again in my grandmother's kitchen, the smell of hot grease and cinnamon. At 11, I heard it, the lightest drag of something along the outside of the house. A scuff and then silence. A long, prowling kind of silence, as if something were making a decision on the other side of the wall. I told myself it was a branch, and eventually I slept because the body makes its bargains. In the morning, the fog sat on the street like it had pulled up a chair. I made coffee and carried it to the back door. The yard was just a rectangle of wet grass and a wooden fence with one missing slat. Through the gap, the woods looked like a painting that had been smudged. The fog turned the trees to silhouettes. I thought about the route and the caution the marshals had poured into their voices, and decided I could walk the yellow loop without betraying anyone. My breath looked like a small white animal as I set out. Sleepy Hollow in daylight is just a town that has learned to live with its own costume. There's a bakery that leans too hard on pumpkin in October, and a hardware store that smells like dust and twine. On the corner, an elderly man with a veteran's cap fed sparrows pieces of muffin, and when I said good morning, he nodded, as if to say yes to the morning and not to me. The cemetery fence ran long and low beside the road, iron lacework damp with the fog. Inside, the stones were a crowd of shoulders. The confusion in my head loosened some with the walking. That way, anxiety sometimes breaks apart like clumps in a stream. I had almost convinced myself that the night sound was only a branch when I felt it. Not sound, not sight exactly, but the body's version of a memory. The skin along my upper arms tightened. The exact sensation of someone stepping too close to read your phone over your shoulder. I kept walking and told myself not to dramatize. 12 steps later, the feeling was not behind me, but almost beside me. A slip of air as if another set of lungs had taken my rhythm. I turned so fast the coffee threw itself out of the cup. There was no one, just the fence and the stones and the long patient trees. The breath went out of me in a short, foolish laugh that was more like a bark. The sound a kid makes when he wants to scare the dark into revealing itself. A pickup rattled past. The driver, a woman in a reflective vest, glanced over and flicked 2 fingers off the steering wheel. I lifted a hand. My heart slowed. I told myself something harmless, a jogger. A dog, a fluke in the wind. At the corner store, I bought a newspaper I didn't intend to read, and a pack of gum I didn't intend to chew so I could practice being ordinary. The clerk, a kid with acne that looked painful, handed me my change and said, "You new around here, Mr. Crane?" His pronunciation of the name made the hairs on my wrist stir. I remembered the Marshalls. Say it like it's yours. "Yeah," I said. "A week or so. You renting the white colonial by the old Burt field?" I calculated how normal people smiled. "That's me," he nodded. "My aunt says that place is drafty. Watch your windows. Fog gets in here like it pays rent." Back on the sidewalk, a woman about my age was corralling a toddler into a stroller that didn't want to cooperate. "You were booking it," she said, laughing a little as if we'd already been talking. "I saw you go by the fence. Thought somebody was tailing you. Gave me a start. Tail someone was behind me." She frowned. "Big guy? Like tall?" "He was right up on you." I almost said something. "You really didn't see him?" My mouth filled with saliva. When I tried to swallow, it felt like I'd taken a gulp of creek water. "No," I said. "Must have missed him." The toddler, a girl in pink with a stubborn set to her mouth, said, "Man had a hat," like she was offering it to me in case I'd lost it. The mother made a face at her, embarrassed. I said, "Have a good one," as if I owned that sentence, and walked away too quickly. That night I dreamed of the courthouse hallway. I was walking down it and the doors were on both sides at once, as if the building had made up new rules while I was in it. I woke with my jaw aching and the sense that I'd been shouting into my pillow. The room was dark and very still. From the woods came a sound like someone working a shovel into earth. A rhythmic shove, the blade finding its bite, then that soft effort grunt, the one men make without meaning to. It went on for a long time. When it stopped, the silence was the kind that has a shape. I got out of bed and stood there like a fool in my shorts, hands hanging, listening to a quiet so dense it was a pressure in the ears. In the morning, there were footprints. Not on the grass, on the back steps. Mud tracked up to the door, not boots but something thin-soled with a straight heel. Prints too narrow for the men I had known. I crouched and touched one and my finger came away dark. The Marshalls had said call. Don't try to be brave. I stared at my phone, at the number, at my thumb hovering. Then I thought about the men who would like to see me made into a cautionary tale, about how very human it is to see patterns where we need them, and I shoved the phone into my pocket. Fear dressed as logic works both ways. I did the loop again because I didn't know what else to do. Outside the fence, a tour was happening. A handful of people grouped around a young guide with a scarf. Her voice carried in a friendly way. She made the dead sound like old neighbors. I moved by and I didn't look because looking would be like confessing to interest I shouldn't show. In the window of a closed barber shop, the glass silvered my reflection into a ghost. For a second, it was just me behind me. Then it wasn't. There was a figure over my left shoulder close enough that if it had been real, I would have felt its coat on my arm. No face, not really. A suggestion of it. A blur where features should be, and that wrongness that makes the scalp tighten. What was clear was the clothing. A dark coat with high, narrow lapels and a waistcoat underneath it. A suggestion of a stiff collar, and a hat with a low crown, the brim narrow. I flinched so hard I clapped my shoulder with my own hand and turned. The sidewalk was empty. The reflection was only me again, white around the mouth, breathing like I'd been running. The guide had stopped talking. Her group had gone quiet too, a silence that found my back. I turned and they were looking at me like I had done a trick I couldn't explain. "You okay, sir?" The guide called. "Fine," I said, ridiculous word, and moved on without grace. That night the digging started earlier. I did not go to the back door. I stood in the hall between bedroom and kitchen and realized that the house made a little wind of its own when you stood there. A draft that ran along the floorboards. They had warned me about fog, the way it finds seams. I would have sworn the air smelled like turned soil, that iron scent that isn't blood but tells the body a story about it anyway. On the third day, a man knocked. Not a marshal, a local, mid-50s, face like a sled that's seen too many hills. Wearing a jacket with a patch that said grounds. He introduced himself as Lou and said he took care of the cemetery and a few of the old lots like mine. "You're new," he said, eyeing the doorframe. "You know this house was moved." "Moved?" He tipped his chin toward the trees. Came from up in the old farm lane, early 60s. They straightened the road, brought this down on a flatbed. My dad helped. That'll be why your floors talk. Old houses never forget where they started. Lovely, I said, and tried to keep the edges off it. There's a thing, sorry to trouble you. He shifted, embarrassed in the way men get when they bring you a fact that feels indecent. Some of the old stones up near the fence don't mark anything anymore. The town did a survey ages back, and there are, well, burials that never got stones. You see where I'm going. I saw it like a photograph developing, a dark rectangle in earth. Rough hands, prying up, pushing down, under this house. Not saying for sure, he said quickly, but if you hear odd things at night, sometimes it's the ground settling when the temperature goes. Old loam talks, that's my mama's phrase. Has anyone mentioned seeing a man by the fence? I heard myself ask. Tall maybe, old coat, a hat. He looked past me into the house like my question had stepped around me and stood in the hall. More in October, he said lightly. Hard to tell the stories from the folks who want one. Then he squinted a little. Your back stoop shows prints. You got kids coming around? I don't, I said. He made a sympathetic sound and left, and the house felt more closed after I'd shut the door. I locked it and then I checked it again 2 minutes later because that is how you try to spend fear. You spend it like it is money and you can make more. I tried to watch television. The laugh track made me feel like someone was behind me breathing through their nose. I turned it off and went to the sink to wash a cup I had already washed. The window over the sink had the old imperfect glass that makes the world quiver at the edges. In it, the kitchen floated behind me like a stage set. My own head, my shoulders, and the hat. Low crown, narrow brim. Close enough that my breath fogged the glass and theirs did not. Leave, and I said, because sometimes your mouth moves without consulting you. The word sounded small. I could hear the creek, the little stream in the trees. I could hear a train roll through town, a distant iron breath. I could hear a shovel go into ground, the small refusal noise the earth makes when it has to move for someone. The marshals texted a check-in. I typed fine and erased it. Typed all good and erased that too. I told myself the men I had crossed didn't need any ghost to do their work. If a car slowed on the road, if a stranger took a photo at the corner, if the young guide's face kept turning up in my head because it was open and human and that made me think of how easily human things are broken, none of that was a reason to panic. I sent the text, fine, boring, you win. That night I didn't sleep. I lay with the lamp on and watched the wall. The digging went on at intervals, patient and unashamed. I counted the beats and tried to find a human rhythm in it, one I could hate, and failed. Around 3, a softness came into the room, a kind of pressure. My ears popped, like on an airplane. Footsteps light as moth wings came down the hall. There is a point where fear becomes a decision. I got up. In the hallway mirror, my face looked like my father at the end of a long day. My mouth was set like his. The glass had a purplish tint in the lamplight. Behind me, a shoulder appeared, slow as breath. A coat resolved, black with a sheen of damp. The line of a jaw that wasn't quite right, as if it had been dreamed from a description. The hat tilted, considering me. Not a threat in it. Not the hot human intent I know how to brace against. This was colder. This was a fact asserting itself. What do you want? I asked the dumbest question we ask our dead. The hat lifted a courteous inch like a greeting or a good day, sir. Then the figure was closer, not by walking, but by that unpleasant jump in space that reflections can do, a refusal to obey the rules of corridors. I stepped back and hit the wall. The lamp flickered once, a hiccup in light. Out by the creek, something splashed, heavy and unhappy. I can't go, I said. I didn't mean the house. I meant the program. The line I had stepped across that had lifted me out of my life and set me down here like a mismatched piece in a puzzle. I can't leave. The figure leaned as if listening. In the mirror, my chest rose and fell quick as a rabbit's. I waited for words and got none. Instead, an image broke over me with the clarity that sometimes comes at the edge of sleep. Man in shirt sleeves, sleeves rolled. The sun a white coin in a winter sky. A hole part dug and the slow work of lowering. No stone, no pastor. The kind of burial the living give when the dead are inconvenient. I saw a heel catch and a body tilt and a curse offered because the body does not care about your reverence when it is that heavy. I saw a mess made good enough. I saw it right where the back steps now sit. The place in earth that remembers. Okay, I said. Okay. I don't know what I was agreeing to. Maybe only that the past exists where you put it, not where you want it. At dawn, without deciding, I borrowed a shovel from under the porch. The ground by the steps was soft. I dug until sweat ran into my eyes and the sun pulled the fog to pieces. About 2 feet down, the shovel hit wood with a hollow tone that thudded in my chest. My hand stopped working. I squatted there and pressed my palms to my knees and breathed through my mouth because the smell rising was not rot anymore. Not after so long, but it was still a smell the body dislikes. I brushed away dirt. It was not a coffin like in the movies. Boards rough and wide, a nail that had bled rust into the grain. I did not open it. I do not have some heroic claim to make about reverence. It was fear and something like respect and the sense that if I crossed that last inch, the world would tip. I sat there until a crow scolded from the fence and the day became just a day again. Then I went inside and washed my hands until the water ran clear. The marshals called at noon. There had been chatter. A car seen near the turnpike with plates that made someone's neck hair rise. They were moving me sooner than planned. Pack light. Don't leave notes. Wipe what you can. I looked at the hole, at the disturbed earth. I took the shovel back under the porch and leaned it where it had been. I stood in the kitchen and made myself a sandwich I didn't eat, because there is no better way to pretend control than to make lunch. They came at 3. The driver with the patient voice, a different partner. They moved with a pace that pretended there was no hurry. As we reached the door, I turned back to the sink to rinse the uneaten sandwich down the disposal and saw the window go dim, as if a cloud had crossed the sun. In the glass behind my shoulder, the hat rested. It was not close now. It stood on the back steps over the place where the earth showed a darker rectangle. It did not lift in greeting. "I'll be right out," I told the marshals. I opened the back door and cold air walked in. The figure did not move. I got the sense of patience so long it made a mockery of the word. The kind of patience that outlasts wooden names. I said, "They're moving me." My voice cracked, not from fear but from something like apology. "I didn't bring this to you on purpose." The creek said nothing. The trees watched like they always do. A train spoke its one short breath. The hat didn't dip, didn't threaten, didn't forgive. It just was, the way a boundary is. I closed the door and went to the car. The driver checked the mirrors in that professional way, eyes quick and precise, reading the world for edges. The tires hissed over damp leaves as we pulled away. We passed the cemetery fence. Between the pickets, I glimpsed a man in an old coat, or maybe just the idea of one, standing among the shoulders of stone. The marshals were talking about routes and safe motels and how river towns are tricky because of bridges. I answered when I had to. In the barbershop window we passed, the glass threw us back. For a second, I saw myself in the back seat, and behind me, in the same spot he'd taken in the reflection, the hat occupied its narrow slice of space. Not closer, not farther, just there, like a fact that doesn't change because you don't look at it. We took the on-ramp and the town fell behind. The trees thinned, then thickened again. I waited for the feeling to lift, for the air around me to become only air. It didn't. It settled like a coat put over my shoulders by someone who has decided on my behalf. Maybe the men I testified against would still come, with their hot greed and their knives that no work. Maybe they wouldn't. Either way, something else had laid its claim first. They can move your name. They can move your house. The ground you stand on is another matter. Wherever they set me next, a window will hold a certain trick of light, and behind my shoulder a hat will rest, patient as winter. If I forget and begin to believe in the safety of distance, the glass will remind me. Not threatening, not forgiving. The lands passed watching the man who thought he could step outside of his own. And somewhere a shovel will find the earth again, and the earth will give that soft refusal, and then it will yield. Mara Chen had been photographing dead things for 6 years before anything dead photographed her back. It started as a niche, like most freelance careers do. A magazine article about Victorian morning photography, a coffee table book about New Orleans crypts. Then the calls kept coming. Death tourism was booming and Mara had the eye for it. The ability to make decay look dignified, to frame loss as art. She told herself it was documentary work, preserving history. Her therapist suggested it might be something else, but Mara stopped going after that session. The Sleepy Hollow project seemed perfect. A week shooting the old Dutch church cemetery for a publisher in Manhattan, plus whatever atmospheric shots she could gather from the town itself. Easy money, romantic location. She'd read Irving's story in college, had the usual American familiarity with the Headless Horseman legend. But honestly, it was just another graveyard to her. She'd seen plenty. The Airbnb was exactly what she expected. A renovated cottage on the outskirts of town, all exposed beams and modernized plumbing awkwardly grafted onto 18th century bones. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Vandemark, met her at the door with fresh bread and an unnecessarily detailed history of the property. Mara smiled and nodded, already planning her shots for the next morning, barely listening to something about the cottage being moved from its original foundation in 1823. "The light's best right after dawn," Mrs. Vandemark said, handing over the keys. "But don't stay in the cemetery after dark. It's not safe." "Because of ghosts?" Mara asked, smiling. "Because of ice," Mrs. Vandemark replied without humor. "The paths get slippery." The Old Dutch Church cemetery exceeded expectations. The morning fog cooperated beautifully, clinging to the weathered headstones like something alive. Mara worked methodically, her Canon catching the interplay of light and shadow, the way moss consumed carved names, how time reduced certainty to suggestion. She photographed the grave of Eleanor Van Tassel, the supposed inspiration for Irving's Katrina. She captured Abraham Martling's stone, the inscription barely legible. The work was meditative, quiet. She was alone except for a handful of tourists who appeared mid-morning and left quickly. Disappointed that death, even historical death, wasn't very entertaining in person, she took perhaps 200 shots that first day. That night, transferring files to her laptop in the cottage, she noticed it for the first time. In a photo of the Van Tassel grave, behind her and slightly to the left, she knew it was behind her because she recognized the angle. The headstones she'd been facing, there was a blur, not the motion blur of a tourist walking through frame. Something else. A vertical smear, roughly person-shaped like someone had stood perfectly still while the world moved around them. She'd learned to ignore photographic anomalies years ago. Lens flares, sensor dust, atmospheric moisture catching light in weird ways. Digital photography created ghosts constantly, mundane technical ghosts. She flagged it for cropping and moved on. The second day brought overcast skies, perfect for the brooding aesthetic the publisher wanted. Mara worked deeper into the cemetery, photographing the older stones, the ones dated from the 1600s. Names and dates swallowed by entropy. She felt good. Productive. She grabbed lunch from a diner in town where a waitress called her Han, and the coffee tasted like it had been brewed during the Revolutionary War. Back at the cottage that evening, transferring the day's work, she found it again. 3 separate photos, all showing the same blurred figure, always behind her, always vertical. In one image, photographing a cluster of children's graves, the blur seemed closer than before. It stood where she would have been standing moments earlier before she'd moved to get a better angle. Mara zoomed in. The blur had definition now if you looked carefully. The suggestion of a coat, something that might be arms hanging at its sides. No face, nothing that clear, but the implication of posture. Someone standing very still watching her work. She checked the XIF data. All 3 photos taken minutes apart. Different locations in the cemetery, no one else visible in any frame. She'd been alone. She was certain she'd been alone. That night, she dreamed about being in a dark room watching a photograph develop in chemical baths. Her own face appearing first, smiling at the camera. Then behind her, emerging slowly from the blank paper, a second figure resolving into focus. She woke before she could see its face. The third day, Mara shot with her camera's continuous mode, taking bursts of frames hoping to catch whatever was causing the effect. A technical explanation existed. It had to. Maybe something wrong with her sensor. Maybe she'd gotten moisture inside the lens. But her hands shook slightly as she worked, and she found herself turning around more often than necessary, checking the empty paths between graves. That evening's review made her stomach clench. The figure appeared in a dozen photos now, and it was sharper. Much sharper. She could see the outline of a long coat, definitely. Boots, the suggestion of hands. And the posture, it was facing her direction. Facing where the camera was, where she'd been standing. In every single image, it oriented toward her. In one photo, taken near sunset by the church itself, she could almost make out a face. Not features exactly, but the shape of a head, something pale where the face should be, turned fully toward the lens. Mara called her ex-girlfriend, a photography professor in Boston, and sent 3 files. "Does this look like sensor damage to you?" The reply came 30 minutes later. "What the hell are you shooting?" "Those aren't artifacts. That's something in frame. Check your backgrounds more carefully. There was nothing there. Then your files are corrupted, or someone's messing with you. But Mara hadn't shown anyone these photos. They existed only on her camera and laptop. She ran virus scans, nothing. She examined the raw files directly. The figure was there in the original captures, not added later. Whatever the camera was seeing it when she pressed the shutter. She had 2 days left on her shoot. The professional thing would be to finish the job, deliver the files, let the publisher's photo editors deal with any anomalies. But Mara had photographed death for 6 years, and she recognized the feeling growing in her chest. The same feeling you got in certain houses, certain rooms. The feeling that something was paying attention. On the 4th day, she forced herself back to the cemetery. She needed maybe 50 more shots to fulfill her contract. The morning was colder, the sky threatening rain. She worked quickly, efficiently, trying not to think about what might be appearing in frame behind her. Trying not to turn around every 30 seconds. At one point, photographing a grave from the 1680s, she felt it. A presence. Not supernatural, just the ordinary human awareness of being watched. She spun around, heart hammering. The cemetery was empty. An oak tree shook in the wind. Dead leaves scattered across the path. Nothing else. She took the photo anyway, hands trembling on the camera. Then she walked back toward the entrance, done for the day, maybe done with the project entirely. That evening, she almost didn't review the files. Almost packed her equipment and drove back to the city. But professional discipline won. She needed to know what she had. The figure was in every photo, every single one, and now she could see it clearly. A man in a long dark coat, old-fashioned, standing 20 feet behind her in some shots, closer in others. His face was visible now, pale, drawn, with eyes that were too dark, too deep. He was looking directly at the camera in each image. Directly at her. In the final photo of the day, the one she'd taken right before leaving, he was standing 10 feet away. Close enough that she should have seen him in her peripheral vision. Close enough that she could make out details. The old brass buttons on his coat, the mud on his boots, the absolute stillness of his posture. Mara felt cold water run down her spine. She'd been alone in that cemetery. She would have seen him. She scrolled back through every photo from the week. There he was in chronological order, getting closer. Moving through the cemetery in her wake, following her path, always behind her, always watching the camera, always getting closer. The final shoot was tomorrow. She needed maybe a dozen more images, some detail shots of carved symbols and epitaphs. Then she could leave. She didn't sleep that night. Every sound in the old cottage seemed too loud. The wind against windows, floorboards settling. Once, around 3 in the morning, she heard something that might have been footsteps on the porch, but when she looked, there was nothing. Just fog pressing against the glass like breath. The last morning, Mara made herself go back. She shot quickly, carelessly, just getting something usable. Her hands were shaking too hard for careful composition. She didn't look at the LCD screen, didn't check focus, just pointed and shot and moved on, eager to be finished. By noon, she was done. She packed her equipment in the cottage, laptop and camera and lenses in their cases. She'd review everything at home, deliver the files remotely. She just wanted out. But professional curiosity is a hard habit to break. Before she left, she transferred the morning's files to her laptop. One last look, he was in all of them. Close enough now to touch. In one image, his hand was extended toward the camera, reaching forward, fingers spread. She could see the lines in his palm. The final photo made her stand up so fast her chair fell backward. She hadn't taken a final photo, but there it was, time-stamped from that morning, dated and geotagged to the cottage. A self-timer shot, apparently. Her laptop, her equipment scattered on the table. And her, sitting in frame, looking at the screen, behind her chair, standing directly over her shoulder, close enough that his coat brushed her hair, was the man from the cemetery. Crystal clear now, perfectly in focus. His face inches from hers, his eyes looking not at the camera but down at the back of her head. His hand resting on her shoulder, she remembered it then. The weight on her shoulder while she was working. The faint smell of earth and old fabric. The coldness that seeped through her shirt. She'd felt it and ignored it, too focused on the screen. Telling herself it was imagination, stress, poor sleep. She'd ignored it. The photo was time-stamped 20 minutes ago. Mara turned around slowly, her breath catching, knowing and not wanting to know. The cottage was silent. The chair behind her was empty. But the smell remained. Wet earth, old graves, something patient and cold. And on her shoulder, where she could still feel the weight like a memory, there were muddy fingerprints that hadn't been there before. She never delivered those files. Never went back to death tourism. The camera sits in her closet now, untouched. But sometimes, late at night, she wonders about the photos she didn't take. The ones the timer captured while she slept. The images waiting in memory cards she's too afraid to check. And she wonders, with growing certainty, what develops in the darkness when you've spent years teaching the dead how to be seen. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and lemon furniture polish, the kind of place where time moved differently. Sarah Grayson sat between her brothers in chairs that creaked with every nervous shift, listening to a man she'd never met read the will of an uncle she barely remembered. Marcus, the eldest, kept checking his phone. Daniel, the youngest, stared at the ceiling tiles like they contained answers to questions nobody was asking. Sarah tried to remember the last time the three of them had been in the same room. 7 years? 8? Their mother's funeral, probably. Before the fighting over her jewelry started. Uncle Thomas had died alone in his Sleepy Hollow estate, the lawyer explained. No wife, no children. Just a decaying Victorian house on 6 acres and a family plot in the village cemetery that dated back to 1743. The estate needed to be settled, the graves assessed for historical preservation, the property prepared for sale. He needed them to come up together. Just for a weekend, Marcus spoke first. Can't this be handled remotely? The lawyer, a thin man named Pemberton, removed his glasses. Your uncle's will specifically requires all 3 beneficiaries to tour the property together. Those were his exact words. Together, he paused. There are some complications with the land deed. Very old complications. That Friday, Sarah drove up from Philadelphia alone, watching autumn strip the trees bare along the highway. The GPS took her through Sleepy Hollow's historic district, where tourist shops sold Headless Horseman t-shirts and overpriced candles. She'd booked a room at the Crane Inn. Marcus had chosen the Washington Irving Hotel across town. Daniel was staying at some bed and breakfast near the river. Even now, even for 2 nights, they couldn't share space. The cemetery tour was scheduled for Saturday morning, 10 o'clock sharp. Sarah arrived first, parking near the wrought iron gates where fog still clung to the ground like something living. The place was older than America itself. Headstones tilting at strange angles, names worn away by centuries of weather. She pulled her jacket tighter against the October chill. Marcus arrived in a rental Mercedes, Daniel on a motorcycle that seemed wildly impractical for a cemetery visit. They nodded at each other. Didn't hug. This is ridiculous, Marcus said. I've got a deposition Monday. We all have lives, Sarah replied, though she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. The groundskeeper appeared from behind a mausoleum like he'd been waiting there all morning. He was older than the stones, it seemed, with hands gnarled as tree roots and eyes that didn't quite focus on any of them directly. You're the Graysons, he said. Not a question. We're here to see the family plot, Sarah said. He nodded slowly, then turned and began walking without checking if they followed. They did, threading between graves, reading names that meant nothing. Morrison, Van Tassel, Crane. The fog hadn't burned off yet. Everything felt muffled, distant. The Grayson plot sat in the northeast corner, enclosed by a low iron fence that had rusted through in places. 12 graves, the groundskeeper explained. The oldest from 1743, the newest Uncle Thomas from 3 weeks ago. The earth on his grave still looked raw. Your people go back, the groundskeeper said. Way back. Before the Revolution. Before this was even called Sleepy Hollow. He knelt beside one of the older stones, brushed away moss to reveal a name. Ezekiel Grayson, 1720, 1743. What happened to him? Daniel asked. 23 years old. Hanged, the groundskeeper said simply. For stealing. Though some say he was innocent. Some say his brother, your direct ancestor, let him swing for a crime he didn't commit. Kept the family land that way. He stood, bones popping audibly. Lots of stories in this place. Most of them true enough. Sarah felt something cold touch the back of her neck. Just wind, she thought. Just October air. The groundskeeper looked at each of them in turn. Folks hear things in this cemetery. Especially near old graves. Especially Grayson graves, he paused. If you hear footsteps behind you while you're here, don't turn around. Just keep walking. Keep your eyes forward. That's not ominous at all, Marcus said, trying for humor. The groundskeeper didn't smile. Ominous is turning around. Some things are worse when you look at them directly. He touched his cap. I'll be at the shed if you need me. Take your time. He left them there in the fog and the silence. They spent another 20 minutes walking the plot, taking photos for the estate lawyer, checking which stones needed repair. Nobody mentioned the groundskeeper's warning. Nobody mentioned much of anything. By 11, they'd finished. They agreed to meet at the estate house at 2 to go through Uncle Thomas's papers. Sarah spent lunch at a diner downtown, not tasting her food, thinking about a man hanged at 23 while his brother watched. While his brother benefited, family betrayal as inheritance passed down through centuries like china or silver. Her phone buzzed. Daniel. Anyone else think that groundskeeper was fucking weird? Marcus replied, everything about this is weird. Let's just get through tomorrow. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The Crane Inn had charm but terrible water pressure and radiators that clanked like chains. She'd brought work, depositions to review for a custody case, but couldn't focus. Around midnight, she gave up and took a bath, hoping hot water might unknot the tension in her shoulders. She was drying off when she heard them. Footsteps in her room, slow, deliberate steps, the specific creak of someone walking across old floorboards. Sarah froze, towel clutched to her chest, listening. The footsteps moved from the window toward the bathroom door. Stop just outside, hello? Her voice sounded small. Nothing. She wrapped herself in the hotel robe and opened the door fast, like ripping off a bandage. The room was empty. Window closed, door locked from the inside. She checked the closet under the bed. Nothing. Old building, she thought. Old buildings make noise. She was climbing into bed when she felt it. Cold breath on the back of her neck. Not air from a vent. Breath. She could feel it move her hair. The mirror above the desk reflected her bed. Reflected her sitting there, covers pulled up. And reflected something else. A figure standing behind her headboard. Tall, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. A long coat with tarnished buttons, a high collar, dark breeches. The face was wrong, too pale, too familiar. Uncle Thomas stared back at her from the mirror with eyes that weren't entirely his anymore. Sarah spun around. Nothing there. Nothing behind the headboard but wall. She looked back at the mirror. The figure was closer now. Close enough to touch her shoulder. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Marcus looked terrible. Daniel looked worse. They met at the estate house, a sagging Victorian that smelled like mildew and disappointment, and started going through boxes in the study without speaking much. But Sarah could feel something humming between them, some shared frequency of fear. Finally, Daniel said, "Did anything weird happen to either of you last night?" Marcus stopped sorting papers. Define weird. Footsteps. In your room. And something in the mirror. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What was in your mirror? Uncle Thomas, Daniel said. Except not. He was wearing old clothes, like colonial old. And every time I looked at a different mirror, bathroom, window reflection, he was closer. Marcus sat down heavily. Jesus Christ, me too. I thought I was losing my mind. Same, Sarah whispered. Exactly the same. They looked at each other, really looked, maybe for the first time in years. 3 people who shared blood and history and now apparently a haunting. The groundskeeper, Marcus said. He warned us. Don't turn around if we hear footsteps. We all turned around, Daniel said. Sarah moved to the window. The cemetery was visible from here, its stones jutting up through fog like broken teeth. Uncle Thomas knew something. That's why he made us come here together. That's why the will specified all 3 of us. She found it an hour later, in a metal box under floorboards in the study. A journal dated 1743, written in fading ink by Ezekiel Grayson. The entries were sparse, desperate. He'd been accused of stealing land deeds from a Dutch family, forging new ones with Grayson names. But it wasn't him. It was his brother, Jonathan. Their father was dying, the inheritance unclear. Jonathan had stolen the deeds, let Ezekiel hang for it, claimed everything. The last entry, written the night before his execution. I will not rest. Neither will any who carry Jonathan's blood. What he stole will be reclaimed generation by generation until the debt is paid. A curse. A real actual curse. We have to give it back, Sarah said. The land. We have to return it. To who? Marcus asked. Everyone's dead. A Dutch family is gone. Then we give it to the state. The Historical Society. We don't sell the estate. We can't profit from it. That night, they stayed together in the estate house, unwilling to separate. Around midnight, the footsteps started. In the hallway. On the stairs. Getting closer. All three of them heard the same thing. Don't turn around. They didn't. They sat facing each other in the study, listening to someone walk circles around their chairs, feeling cold breath on their necks, watching each other's faces for signs of whatever stood behind them. In the window's reflection, Sarah could see him clearly now. Not just Uncle Thomas's face anymore. It shifted between faces, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Every Grayson who'd died carrying the weight of Ezekiel's curse. All of them standing behind the three siblings who represented the end of Jonathan's line. At dawn, they signed papers transferring the estate to the Sleepy Hollow Historical Trust. No sale. No profit. The curse would end with them. Except it didn't, not really. Sarah still hears footsteps some nights. She never turns around. Marcus has stopped looking at mirrors. Daniel sold his apartment and lives in hotels, moving every few days. The debt might be paid, but some inheritances can't be refused. Some family sins sink into the blood itself, carried forward whether you want them or not. And some footsteps, once they start following you, never really stop. I've always believed that the best true crime stories aren't about the blood or the violence. They're about the holes people leave behind, the unanswered questions that keep families awake at night, the cold cases that haunt small towns for decades. That's why I started Forgotten Voices, my podcast about unsolved disappearances. I thought I understood absence, thought I could chase it into dark corners and drag it into the light. I was wrong about what lives in those corners. My name is Caroline Webb, and I've been chasing ghosts for 3 years now. Not literal ones, obviously. At least that's what I used to tell myself. I investigated the gaps in police files, the witnesses who were never properly interviewed, the evidence that fell through bureaucratic cracks. My podcast had a decent following, maybe 40,000 regular listeners, enough to quit my marketing job, enough to feel like I was doing something that mattered. The Dorothy Marsh case brought me to Sleepy Hollow in October. Dorothy was a 52-year-old librarian from Connecticut who vanished in October 1987 after visiting the Old Dutch Church Cemetery. She'd been fascinated by the legend of Sleepy Hollow since childhood. Her husband reported her missing when she didn't return to their bed and breakfast. Police found her rental car in the cemetery parking lot, keys in the ignition, engine still warm. Her camera was on the passenger seat, half a roll of film exposed. She was never seen again. The case had everything my listeners loved: a mysterious location, no evidence of foul play, and that tantalizing detail about the undeveloped film. The police had processed it, of course. The photos showed exactly what you'd expect: headstones, fallen leaves, the Gothic silhouette of the church. Nothing useful. But I'd learned that sometimes the story isn't in what people found. It's in what they stopped looking for. I arrived on a Wednesday afternoon when the autumn light turned everything golden and desperate. Sleepy Hollow was exactly what you'd imagine: a tourist town that had weaponized its own legend. Halloween decorations hung from every lamppost. Gift shops sold plastic horsemen and foam pumpkins. But drive 10 minutes in any direction, and you'd find the real village underneath, the one where people actually lived, where the hardware store had been run by the same family for 90 years, where everyone knew everyone else's business. I'd rented a small cottage on the edge of town and spent my first 2 days doing preliminary interviews. The local historical society, the retired police chief who'd worked Dorothy's case. Her husband had passed away in 2003, but I tracked down their daughter, now in her 50s, who spoke about her mother with the careful distance of someone who'd long ago made peace with never knowing. None of them gave me anything new. But they all, every single one, did something strange when I mentioned I'd be recording at the cemetery. The Historical Society director, Mrs. Chen, had paused mid-sentence, her coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. "You're going alone." "I always record alone," I'd said. "Better audio quality." She'd set down her cup carefully. "If you're walking the old paths and you hear footsteps behind you." She stopped herself, laughed awkwardly. "Never mind. Old local superstition. But she didn't finish the thought, and something in her eyes made me not push it. The retired police chief, Tom Hendricks, had the same reaction. We'd been sitting in his kitchen going through his old case notes when I mentioned my recording schedule. He'd gone quiet, staring at his hands. We had 3 other incidents, he'd said finally, before Dorothy and after. People hearing things on those paths, feeling followed. One woman in 91 refused to go back, said something. He'd shaken his head. "I put it in my reports." Got laughed at by the state investigators. What did she say? That something walked behind her all the way from the old section to the parking lot. She never turned around, and when she got to her car, the footsteps stopped. She looked back and there was nothing there. But when she got home and developed her photos, he'd trailed off. What was in the photos? That's the thing. She never said. Threw them away, moved to Florida within the month, wouldn't return calls. He'd looked at me directly then. My advice? Don't go up there after 4 o'clock. And if you do, don't walk those paths alone, but of course I did. That's what I do. That's the whole point. I arrived at the old Dutch church cemetery at 4:30 p.m. on Friday, when the dying light turned the headstones into jagged shadows. The tourist crowds had thinned. I had my good microphone, my digital recorder, my backup recorder, and my phone. I always recorded redundantly. Too many good interviews had been lost to dead batteries or corrupted files. The cemetery was beautiful in that distinctly New England way, all weathered stone and twisted trees. The oldest graves dated back to the 1700s, their inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of rain. I walked the main path first, getting a feel for the space, recording ambient sound. Wind through bare branches. Distant traffic. A crow calling from somewhere in the woods. Then I headed to the older section where Dorothy had last been seen. The paths here were narrower, less maintained. Fallen leaves made a thick carpet that muffled my footsteps. The light was fading faster than I'd expected, the sun dropping behind the trees. I found the spot where Dorothy's camera had been aimed, based on the angles in her photos. A cluster of Revolutionary War graves tilted with age. I set up my recorder on a flat headstone, "Forgive me, Jeremiah Crane, 1743-1781, and began my standard on-site narration. I'm standing in the oldest section of Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, approximately 50 yards from where Dorothy Marsh's car was found on October 23, 1987. The light is fading, the temperature is dropping, and it's easy to understand why someone might feel unsettled here. But unsettled isn't the same as vanished. Something happened to Dorothy Marsh, and I don't believe it was supernatural. I continued talking, describing the location, the case details, my theories. I was maybe 10 minutes into my recording when I heard it. Footsteps behind me. On the leaf-covered path, I stopped talking. The footsteps stopped. I turned around. The path was empty. I told myself it was an echo of my own movement, leaves settling, something completely ordinary. I went back to my recording. But my voice sounded different now, tighter. The footsteps started again. Matching my rhythm exactly. I spun around faster this time. Nothing, just darkening trees and old graves. If you're walking alone and hear someone behind you, don't look. Just leave. Mrs. Chen's unfinished warning came back to me. I suddenly felt very stupid for dismissing it. I packed up my equipment quickly, hands shaking slightly. The walk back to the parking lot felt endless. I didn't hear the footsteps again, but I felt watched. That primitive certainty that you're not alone. My car was the only one left in the lot. I threw my equipment in the passenger seat and drove back to the cottage too fast, checking my rearview mirror compulsively. That night, I transferred my audio files and started editing. That's when I heard it. My voice on the recording. Something happened to Dorothy Marsh, and I don't believe it was supernatural. Then, clear as day underneath my words, a low voice, almost a whisper. She didn't believe either. I felt my skin go cold. I replayed it. The voice was there, distinct, male, so close to the microphone it should have been right behind me. I kept listening. Every time I paused in my narration, there were sounds I hadn't heard in real time, breathing, movement, and once, unmistakably, my name, Caroline. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself it was radio interference, some kind of audio artifact, crosstalk from another device. But I'd been recording for 3 years. I knew what those sounded like. This was different. The next morning, I went back to Tom Hendricks. I brought my laptop and played him the clips. He listened with his eyes closed, and when I finished, he looked older than he had 2 days before. That's what she heard, he said quietly. The woman in 91, she told me it knew her name. What is it? I don't know. But Dorothy Marsh's daughter? She didn't tell you everything. Her mother had been here before 3 years earlier. Took photographs, said she heard things. Came back anyway. Said she had to know what it was. He looked at me hard. Some questions don't have answers you want to live with, but I couldn't stop. That's my fatal flaw, curiosity stronger than common sense. I went back to the cemetery that afternoon with every recording device I owned. This time, the footsteps started immediately. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking, recording, asking questions into the air. Who are you? What do you want? The footsteps grew closer. I could hear breathing now in real time, not just on recordings. Why Dorothy Marsh? A whisper right behind my ear. She listened, I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran all the way to my car, and I didn't stop until I was back at the cottage. I listened to the recordings with my heart hammering. The voice was clearer now. It had been answering every question. The last thing on the recording after I'd stopped running after I'd reached my car. Footsteps continuing. Walking back into the cemetery. And then so faint I had to amplify it 3 times to hear. Come back, Caroline. Finish the story. I left Sleepy Hollow the next morning. I never published that episode. The files sit on my hard drive, encrypted, untouched. But sometimes late at night when I'm editing other episodes, I hear it. Underneath interviews recorded hundreds of miles away. A whisper, breathing, footsteps. It's in every recording now. Growing clearer, I think it followed me home. Michael Pruitt had been a census taker for 6 years, and he'd learned that people fell into 2 categories: those who answered the door with casual indifference, and those who treated him like he was selling timeshares in hell. The folks in Sleepy Hollow, New York seemed to belong to a third, previously undiscovered category. They were terrified of something just over his shoulder. He first noticed it at the Vandermeer place, a narrow colonial with shutters that hadn't been painted since Carter was in office. Mrs. Vandermeer, a woman in her 70s with apple dumpling cheeks, had opened the door with a smile that died the moment she looked past him. Her face went slack, color draining like someone had pulled a plug. She answered his questions in a monotone, eyes fixed on a point roughly 6 inches to the left of his head, and when he thanked her, she shut the door so quickly he had to jerk his clipboard back to avoid losing it. The same thing happened at the Kowalski residence, then the Chens, then at the rectory where Father Oakes actually crossed himself mid-sentence and excused himself, claiming he'd left something on the stove. Michael could smell nothing burning. By his 5th day in Sleepy Hollow, he'd documented this strange behavior in 12 separate households. All different ages, backgrounds, income levels. The only common thread was that look, that awful, bloodless expression of recognition and dread when they answered their doors. Michael wasn't a superstitious man. He believed in data, patterns, observable phenomena. So that evening, back at the Sleepy Hollow Motor Lodge, he did what any rational person would do. He reviewed the footage from his body cam. The Census Bureau had issued them after a taker got attacked in Montana, and Michael wore his religiously, though he'd never had cause to review the recordings, until now. He pulled up the Vandermeer footage first, watching himself knock, waiting, then Mrs. Vandermeer opening the door. She smiled, then she looked past him and her expression changed. Michael paused the video and enlarged it. In the reflection of the door's glass panel, barely visible, was a shape, tall, impossibly thin. Standing directly behind him, his mouth went dry. He scrolled to the Kowalski visit. There, in the glossy paint of their black door, was the same silhouette. Closer, maybe 2 feet behind him now, where at the Vandermeer place it had been 4 or 5. The Chen house had a Ring camera. Michael had waved at it when he arrived. He pulled up that footage with trembling hands. The figure stood 18 inches behind him, close enough that its shadow merged with his. He could see no features, no clothing texture. Nothing but a human-shaped void that seemed to drink in the afternoon sunlight. At Father Oakes' rectory, filmed just that morning, the thing stood close enough to touch him. Michael slammed his laptop shut, heart hammering against his ribs. He stood up, paced the narrow motel room, trying to think rationally. Pareidolia. It had to be. The human brain was wired to see faces and figures where none existed. Or maybe a technical glitch, some artifact of the camera lens. But that didn't explain why everyone who answered their door looked at the exact spot where the figure appeared in the footage. His phone buzzed. A text from his supervisor. "How's Sleepy Hollow? Finish up tomorrow, they need you in Ossining by Wednesday." Michael stared at the message. Tomorrow meant a few more houses. The Albertsons on Grove Street. The Parkers. Old Miss Halloway at the edge of town near the cemetery. The cemetery. He'd gone there on his first evening in town, drawn by the historical markers promising graves from the 1600s. The place sprawled across a hillside, all crooked headstones and tilting monuments, with names worn smooth by centuries of weather. He'd wandered for an hour taking pictures, enjoying the autumn quiet, and he'd taken a grave rubbing. It was from an unmarked stone, a plain slate tablet with nothing but a death date, November 3rd, 1724. He'd done rubbings before at other historic sites. You taped paper over the stone and rubbed crayon across it to capture the carving. This one had taken him 20 minutes because the engraving was so faint. Just the date and a strange symbol beneath it that looked like a figure with outstretched arms. The rubbing was in his car, stuffed in his satchel with his maps and extra clipboards. Michael's hands shook as he retrieved it. He spread the paper across the motel bed, smoothing out the creases. The date stood out in waxy black crayon strokes. Below it, the symbol, except now, looking at it with frightened eyes instead of casual curiosity, Michael could see it wasn't a symbol at all. It was a figure, elongated, arms at its sides. The proportions were wrong, too tall, too thin, just like the shape in his footage. A knock at the door made him jump hard enough to bite his tongue. He tasted copper. "Housekeeping," called a muffled voice. "Not now," Michael managed. His voice sounded strangled. Footsteps retreated. Michael sank onto the bed, staring at the rubbing. "You disturbed something." The thought arrived with the certainty of truth. You took something from that grave and now it wants it back. Or it wants you. He spent a sleepless night alternating between staring at the ceiling and checking every corner of the room. Nothing appeared. His phone camera showed only empty space. But he could feel it, a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched by something patient and hungry. Dawn came like a reprieve. Michael made a decision. He'd finish his route, return the rubbing to the cemetery, and get the hell out of Sleepy Hollow. Simple, logical, the kind of thing that worked in stories. The Albertsons were pleasant, middle-aged. They answered the door together and both saw it. Michael watched their eyes track something behind him, saw their faces go white. He didn't ask questions, just filled out their form and left. The Parkers' teenage son answered, looked past Michael, and vomited on his shoes before slamming the door. By the time Michael reached Miss Halloway's house, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his pen. Her home was a Victorian nightmare of gingerbread trim and peeling paint. Backed up against the cemetery's stone wall, she answered the door with a shotgun. "You the census man?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." She looked past him and her weathered face creased with what might have been pity. "You took something from the old grounds, didn't you?" Michael's heart stopped. How did you? Happens every few years. Some fool takes a souvenir. The follower comes calling." She lowered the shotgun slightly. "How close is it?" "I don't understand." "In the doorways, boy." "How close?" "This morning it was," Michael swallowed, "inches. Maybe 6 inches behind me." Miss Halloway nodded slowly. "Then you ain't got much time. It gets closer with each threshold you cross, when it's close enough to touch you." She made a gesture like smoke dissipating. "What do I do?" "Return what you took. Beg forgiveness. Pray it listens." She started to close the door, then paused. "Don't cross any more thresholds, not one. The crossing is what feeds it, brings it forward. You understand?" Michael nodded, numb. The door closed. He stood on her porch, then carefully stepped down to the walkway without crossing back over the threshold he'd entered through. A small rebellion, probably meaningless, but he had to try something. The cemetery was a 10-minute walk. Michael went straight there, the rubbing clutched in his hand like a talisman. The afternoon sun slanted through bare trees, painting everything in shades of amber and rust, beautiful and uncaring. He found the unmarked stone without difficulty. It looked ordinary in daylight, just another weathered slate among hundreds. Michael knelt beside it and spread the rubbing on the ground. "I'm sorry," he said, feeling foolish and terrified in equal measure. "I didn't know. I'm returning it, please." The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the rubbing. One stuck to the paper covering the figure symbol. Michael waited, barely breathing. Nothing happened. He waited 10 minutes, 20. The sun sank lower, shadows lengthening between the stones. Finally, stiff with cold and fear, Michael stood. Maybe it had worked. Maybe the thing, the follower, whatever it was, had accepted his apology, and his phone buzzed. A notification from his hotel. "You have a package at the front desk." Michael's blood turned to ice. He hadn't ordered anything. Hadn't given anyone this address except his supervisor and his ex-wife, who hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. The walk back to the motel took forever. The desk clerk, a bored kid with earbuds, handed him a manila envelope with no return address. Michael opened it in the parking lot. Inside was a photograph. Recent, judging by his clothes. It showed him standing in the cemetery, kneeling by the unmarked stone. And standing directly behind him, close enough that its shadow merged with his, was the follower. In the photograph, it had a face, or something like a face. A hollow impression of where features should be. All wrong angles and empty spaces that hurt to look at directly. And it was reaching forward, hands inches from Michael's shoulders. The timestamp on the photo was from 20 minutes ago. Michael's legs went weak. He looked up at the motel at his second-floor room. The door was open, just slightly, but he'd locked it. He knew he'd locked it. Miss Halloway's words echoed, "Don't cross any more thresholds," but his car keys were in that room. His wallet, everything he needed to run. Michael stood in the parking lot as twilight deepened, staring at that open door. Trying to decide if crossing one more threshold would matter. If the follower was already close enough to touch. If returning the rubbing had done anything at all. From the doorway of his room, something moved. Just a shift in the shadows, barely perceptible. Waiting. Michael's phone buzzed again. Another notification, this time from his doorbell camera. The personal one he'd mounted inside his room for extra security. The notification showed a single frame of captured motion. It was the view from inside his room, looking at the door, looking at him standing in the parking lot and in the frame. Standing in the open doorway between them was the follower, fully visible now, impossibly tall, patient, the threshold guardian. Michael realized with creeping horror that it didn't matter if he crossed. The thing wasn't following him anymore. It had moved ahead, waiting at every threshold he might cross, every doorway between him and escape, growing closer with each passage until there was no space left between them at all. His car was across one threshold. Safety was across another. Even leaving Sleepy Hollow meant crossing the town line, another threshold. Michael stood in the parking lot, phone clutched in shaking hands, and understood that he'd been counted after all. Just not in any census the Bureau would ever record. The shadows lengthened, the follower waited, and Michael Pruitt, census taker, stood frozen between thresholds, unable to move forward or back as darkness fell on Sleepy Hollow like a closing door.